Hi, I'm Mike, and I was recently working on my Prophet-600, and the problem that I had made me realize that a good diagnostic video, or this diagnostic video, might be helpful to other folks. So, let's take a look at how the Prophet-600 works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the boards of the Prophet, and then what the main components are. I'm not going to get into the real details of the schematics. You can look at that on your own. But having a general understanding of what each of these chips does, sometimes having an understanding of how basic grammar works is also helpful. Having a basic understanding of what these chips do will help you diagnose the problems. I'm going to start off by giving you an introduction to what the boards are, and show you some tools that you'll need, and then also show you a handy spreadsheet that you can use, and then finally get into actual diagnostics of these ICs. So first, let's start with our introduction to the boards. All right, up here we've got our circuit boards for the controls. And you'll notice that they're connected via this cabling down to this board. So this is the power supply and the logic circuits. Everything that happens on the knobs is sent down into this system. And an important note is that over here, where the synthesizer is, and I'll get into that in more detail, there are no direct connections between any of the knobs and switches and what happens over on the synth engine. Everything is going down into the computer system over here. So let's take a look at how this thing really gets started. So over on this side and out of frame is the transformer that goes into the power supply. We've got some voltage regulators back here. They're providing plus and minus 15 volts DC, as well as plus 5 volts for the digital circuits. And then here is our CPU, and that's again slightly out of frame. This is the Gleegly upgrade, and I would assume if you're the kind of person who's nerdy enough to be watching this video, you've probably already done this upgrade. If you haven't, you should, because it's awesome. It's incredible what this thing does. All right, the rest of this stuff, I'm not going to go into much detail. We've got memory and some controllers and blah, 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 blah. Everything travels over these ribbons over into this section here. And in particular into these 4 demuxers. And what they do is they take the values that come from the digital circuits and turn them into analog circuits that go into these op amps. So this is a row of op amps, this is a row of op amps, and what comes out of these are the control voltages for, the synthesizer. So we're going to look at the synthesizer board in more detail in just a little bit, but the big thing of note is that each of these voices, and the voices are arranged vertically, each voice is like a synthesizer all by itself. So we have oscillators and a VCA and a filter and modulation in there. We have 6 individual synthesizers. So with that said, let's also take a look at some of the tools that we're going to need. So you should obviously have a nice multimeter, or this multimeter. You should also, and if you need to get a good, inexpensive oscilloscope, don't get this one. The other tool that you're going to need is, you might notice, I don't want to move the camera, otherwise it's going to get messed up. Maybe it's actually easier to move the synth. No, of course it's not. You might be able to tell that the keyboard itself has been removed. You don't need the keyboard to do any testing, but you do need a keyboard. So I use something like this, just this little tiny Akai LPK25 jobber, and I can play notes on it. But the other thing I have is just a shim and a clamp, so that if I need to test things, I can drop it onto the instrument and break things. Pretty brilliant. Let's try that again. So just a shim and a clamp. Hop in here. And there we go. So now I've got notes that are being held. I don't care what the notes are. Let me turn that off. Sweet release. So I don't care what the notes are that are being played. I just want to make sure that I'm getting control voltages out to the synth. Another tool you're definitely going to want to have is a jumper, preferably kind of a long one. And a tool you might want to have, but you can really live without, is one of these IC clips. So now let's get into some of the diagnostics. First, we're going to make a basic patch. So let me bring the panel down here. And you can't see everything, but the big thing of note is that the polymod is turned off. Unison is turned off. Our frequency is set to the same note, so I'm going to play a key. Okay, they're on the same note. Sync is off. Sawtooth is off. Sorry. Sawtooth is on, triangle's on, square wave is on, or pulse wave. And I'm going to set the pulse to 50%. Set everything the same. Over on the filter, which you can't see right now, cutoff all the way up, resonance all the way down, envelope all the way up, sustain on both VCAs all the way up, decay, release, and attack set all the way down. And then the mixer is set to, if you're on a Glee, mixer is set all the way up, glide is set all the way up because that's Oscillator B's mixer. If you're on a normal Prophet-600, then just set the mixer right in the middle, and that's full voltage to both oscillators. And LFOs are turned off. Okay, so that's our basic patch. It's a good idea to record this and store this patch. In fact, I'll go ahead and do that now. I'm going to hit record. I'm going to program it into 99. The reason I want to do that is that I might be using this. I'm probably going to be turning the instrument off and on a few times during this process. So it's much easier to store that patch instead of having to call it all back up. Oh, also keyboard set to off on the filter. You don't want to increase the CV with the keyboard's notes. Okay. So let's get into the diagnostics of the instrument. The first thing, if there's no sound coming from the instrument at all, or if it's just being completely insane, then the first thing to check out is the power supply. If your instrument, however, is basically functioning or not on fire, then it's probably not the power supply. Diagnosing the components over here is very complicated, so I always like to start here with the op amps. So these op amps are where the control voltages are sent to the synthesizer voices. So what you really want to do is find out, well, which op amp is controlling what parameter. Well, I've got a handy spreadsheet that is hopefully available from my website that you're welcome to download. And it lists all of the op amps and a few of the other points on some of the other ICs. And you just use it to track what the values are. So let's go on and get started with that. I'm going to hook my multimeter's ground up to one of the ground loops, and it's labeled GND for ground. So I'm going to put my multimeter out here. The other thing I want to do is I want to play 6 notes. I should point out what's wrong with the instrument. I guess that would be a good thing to note. So here we go. Hello, keyboard. So there's my bad voice. Voice 4 doesn't work. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 is fine. But 4 is completely, nothing. So let's get some control voltages out so I can start doing some diagnostics. I'm going to use my little clampy trick. And I'm going to unplug this because we don't need to actually listen to it. I know I've got voltages coming out, so great. Now I'm going to go look at my spreadsheet and start doing some measurements. So let's start with the amplifier control voltages. And that starts on pin 1 of U424. So this is a TLO81 op amp. I think the model at the time was a, was it 7? Let's say UAF 772 LTC. All right, so pin 1 on number 24. So we've got 27, 26, 25, 24. And pin 1. Be careful, you don't want to jump these things. Ah. There we go. There's pin 1. 4.3. So that's cool. I'm going to type that value into my spreadsheet. 4.93, I believe. And move on to my next row. 425-1. So IC 25-1. We'll go here. 4.926. So 4.926. And then U410-10, so 8, 9, 10. Oops, sorry. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that's pin 1 on that. 4.928. 4.928. Great. So I'd keep doing this, and I can compare the values across all of them. You might notice that this also has a tolerance reading, so it will tell you whether you're well out of tolerance or not. Nothing here is particularly remarkable. The lowest that I'm seeing so far is 99.9%, so I really don't care about that. So the control voltages that are going to the amplifier from here, they're totally fine. Now, what I'm not sure about are the oscillators or the filters. Now, I happen to know, because I've actually already diagnosed what the problem is, I happen to know that the problem is in the filter. So let's just jump ahead and check the filter control voltages. Of course, I would have gone through all the oscillator control voltages as well, and the polymod and so on. But just to make this video not 7 hours long, let's take a look at the filters. So, oscillator 1. Filter is 408-1, 5.068, 4097, so that's pin 7, 5.063, 4087. This is exciting stuff, kids. Man, there we go. 5.065, and so on. But the one that I care about is voice 4. That's the one that's been giving me grief. 409-1. Let's see here. 5.065. Okay. And I also already know, and at this point I would have diagnosed the control voltages for the amplifier on voice 4 as well. So, if I'd gone all the way through this, I'd find that all the control voltages are just fine and dandy. So great. I don't have to worry about the stuff that's coming out of the CPU, and I don't have to worry about the control voltage transformation that's happening here. So now I can go on and start taking a look at the voices. I know that my control voltages are good, and it's time to get into the actual synthesizer. So let's take a tour of the voices and the structure of this system. All right, so let's take a look at the board itself. This is the synthesizer board, the voice board. And it's broken down into a pretty logical structure. Vertically, along this line, we have the different voices. So here's voice 1, voice 2, voice 3, voice 4, voice 5, voice 6. And then we have rows of ICs. This row is oscillator A. This row, and I'm jumping down, is oscillator B. These are the same chip. This is a Curtis 3340 synthesizer chip, or oscillator chip. And then we've got some chips in here, again in rows. I'll explain them in a little bit. They're not that important at the moment. And then down here, this is kind of one of the big bad mamma jammas. This is a Curtis 3372 filter. This is also the VCA. So it's not just the filter, it's the VCA. So all your signals are being routed down to here, and then the control voltages for your amplifier coming off of the envelopes are being controlled in here. So we'll get into more detail about what all of the little components do in the neighborhood of the 3372. Your voice chips, your 3340s, are always running. There's always a signal coming out of these chips, even if you're not playing a key. I've got the keys held down by that clamp right now, but even if I didn't, I'd still be getting a signal coming out of a few of the pins on these ICs. There's also a set of 3360s. Now these are dual VCAs, so there's really two VCAs in one chip, and the legs are effectively mirrored across each other. So for each of these, one side of the VCA is for each voice. So for instance, this left side of this 3360 is a VCA that's used by voice 1, whereas the right side is used by voice 2. Now this is not actually the VCA for the instrument. Like I said, your actual amplifier, your actual envelope is coming out of the 3372, controlled by control voltages, ultimately controlled by the computer. This 3340 VCA is used for polymod only. So we'll take a look at that in just a little bit. So let's start finding out what's going on with some of these chips. So when you're doing diagnostics, you want to make sure that your chips are behaving as expected. So this is where you need a good oscilloscope or this one. So I'm going to hop in, and let's get started with the 3340. Let's take a look at the schematic. So there's a lot going on here, but really what we care about is the pin out. And we don't need to worry too much about like the scale adjustment that's on pins 1 through 3. And at the moment, we don't care about the pulse width modulation control. However, there's a really important point about that coming up in a moment. What we care about are the waveforms that come out. And you'll notice that pins 4, 8, and 10 are where your waves come out. So like I said, the waves are always happening no matter what you've got set up. In fact, you can have your waveforms turned off, except on the pulse, and you'll get waves coming out of this. All right, so let's take a look, now that we've seen what the schematic looks like, let's take a look at our points on here. So we'll start with pin 4, and that's a nice, it's pretty good, pretty good sawtooth and square wave. And we'll go on to pin, I keep doing that, pin 8. Slightly fuzzy sawtooth, but I'm okay with that. And then pin 10 is a nice triangle wave. I think this is playing a pretty low note, which is why the waveform is so wide. Let's give a check now to the bad voice, number 4. So decent sawtooth. A little bit of fuzz at the top. Good square wave. And a good triangle. All right. Now, here's a nifty little thing. I'm going to see if I can put this here. And I want to show you what one of the switches does. I don't know if it'll be visible. But what I will be doing is I'm going to be doing this on oscillator A, but oscillator, these switches are controlling another logic circuit, which I'll show you in a second. But pulse width, when you turn the pulse controller off, it is actually the exact same thing as turning pulse width all the way up. There's a control voltage. When you have it turned all the way up, it's set to just over 5 volts, and that just completely clips the pulse. Well, this is doing the exact same thing. Turning it off actually just is the exact same thing as turning it up, and it's sending 5 volts. So I'm going to show you that. Go here on my pulse, and I'm going to adjust the width, and see we're shortening that pulse. It's all the way up. Turn it off, Doesn't make a difference. Now, let's bring that pulse down, turn it off. It's doing the same thing. You can see where the voltage is. So in fact, to prove that theory, I'm going to turn the pulse width all the way down. Down! Now I'm going to turn the pulse off and lose the contact. And notice it went high. See? This is on, it's low, off, it's high. So, off is actually high pulse width. And that goes straight out to the VCA. So let me bring this guy back to normal with a 50% pulse. That's my multimeter being angry. All right, I will give you the attention you need. Everything wants attention. Okay, so my oscillator A is fine. Let's go check oscillator B. So we'll do the same thing. First, I'll check a known good voice, which is this guy. It's another 3340. So my pulse width looks good. My sawtooth looks exactly the same. And triangle looks good. Great. So oscillator 3 is working fine. Let's check it out on 4. Pulse is groovy. Sawtooth also groovy. Triangle, groovy. Cool. So I've determined that my oscillators are working just fine. The oscillators are always running, whether you've got a keyboard down or not. So if you find that your control voltages are good and your oscillators are good, well, now you've eliminated a big section of the board. Now you can go down in this direction. You can check these guys and then check this guy. There's one last little IC up here that you can check. So now that I've done that, I also want to talk about the signal path. So these oscillators, like I said, they're always making noise. And your pulse wave is always going to one of the pins on the 3372. However, your sawtooth and your triangle are going through these ICs right here. Don't know if you can see them very well. These ICs right here. So the first IC is a 4016, goodness, quad bilateral gate switch, something or other. It's a switch. And then this guy is, I think, basically the same thing. Honestly, I don't have it up in front of me. And it's far enough away in front of the camera that I can't actually read what it is. So I'll show you what these guys do. Let's bring up the schematic for the first one. So in this case, we're looking at the actual schematic, not just the IC schematic for the chip. So 4016 is where the pulse comes, or rather the sawtooth comes out of the 3340, and it's where the switch controls what's going to go on with whether it makes it all the way down to the 3372. So it comes in on pin 3, so let's check pin 3. Good. That's what we saw before, so that's a nice thing. And then it leaves on pin 4. So good. There it's showing up, and if I want to test that, if I've got a bad switch, if I find that on one of my voices, one of the waves doesn't work, then it very well could be this logic switch that's right here. So when I turn the switch off on the panel, can't really see it. So I'm reaching around and touching the panel. When I turn the switch for the sawtooth on oscillator A off, notice that on the oscilloscope, the wave goes away. That's it. That's all that this IC is doing. And there's an equivalent for oscillator B. Turn it off. It looks like maybe there's a little bit of leakage. I don't know. It's interesting. So this is an IC that can go bad. And you can tell right here, this is where I've replaced one of these ICs in the past. And a hot tip is to, if you're replacing one of these guys, put in a dip socket. You can see that I've already done that. It just makes it a lot easier to replace these in the future. So if more of them go bad, I'll put in more dip sockets. Sequential was kind enough to put all of the Curtis chips on dips. Chips on dips! Knowing that they may very well explode. The next one to look at is the 4053. I had to look at the screen to remember what they are. So we're doing the same thing as that 4016 switch, but we're just coming out on the triangle wave. Now let's take a look. It comes out of pin 10 on here, and then it goes down to pin 15 on the 4053. So I changed the scale of this to make it a bit easier to see. So pin 15 receives the triangle wave, and sure enough, there it is. And if I turn the triangle wave off, oh, duh. Of course, it's letting it all through because this is just the input. So pin 15 is the input. Pin 2 is the output. There we go. So there's my wave coming out. And if I turn the switch off, then it goes away. So great. All right. And then that makes its way down to pin 6 on the 3372. Now it goes through a capacitor and a resistor, so it's not going to be very loud. I'm going to get into 3372 in just a second. Last thing I want to talk about is the 3360 VCA, which is used for polymod. So if I look on the pin out of polymod, which I believe is this one, I see nothing. I see nothing. So if I want to see something there, I have to turn the polymod up. So I'm going to turn oscillator B all the way up, and now I will see, I believe, oh, I turned the switches on. There we go. I've got a waveform coming out. So that's another thing I can check on voice 4 here. Do I have a wave? I sure do. I have a wave for voice 3. I do. Cool. All right. I've now diagnosed the oscillators, the switches for their positions, and I've diagnosed the polymod. Everything is fine in the voice architecture. Now it just comes down to the filter and the amplifier. Let's see how that's going. All right, so let's take a look at the 3372. So looking at the schematic of the actual chip, we can see that this is an 18-pin dip, and the first four pins are all going to capacitors. And that's because the first 4 pins are actually the 4 poles of the filter. So this is a 24 decibel per octave filter, and each of these capacitors represents one of the 4 poles. So not much that we're going to see if we looked at a waveform. A little bit of a signal coming in, and it's filtered. So you can see that on the screen there. And channel 5 is the control input for the volume on oscillator A. You can see it says channel A level control input. So that is the volume knob. So if I were to go here and maybe move this out of the way, I'll pop this down on pin 5. I'm looking at oscillator A. Actually, I'm going to do this on pin 8, oscillator B, because it's just a little bit easier to see. And now I'm going to turn down the volume using the volume knob, and you can see that that volume is going down. So it's turned all the way up. It's out of frame, but it's 4.93 volts. I can move this slightly more in the frame. Maybe. Close enough. So 4.93 volts. Okay, So our signal's coming in then from oscillator A on pin 6 and from oscillator B on pin 7. Now there's something I didn't mention at the start of this, and that is there are actually two problems, two bad voices. Voice 4 doesn't work at all. No sound comes out. But on voice 3, we actually have sound coming out of oscillator A, but oscillator B is really quiet. So let's go take a look at that. So let's first look at oscillator A, and it's a good signal. And remember, I had the sawtooth, triangle, and pulse wave on, so that's what's giving us that shape of wave. And that's why I like to have those things on, because it's distinct. I can see that this is a mix of those three waveforms. Now if I look at oscillator B, it's very weak. So this is when I would want to go back and start checking some of my other signals. So to do that, I actually have the other probe available. So let's go over and take a look at the schematic. And I want to again double check. Do I get all of my waves out? So pulse is coming out of the 3340. So that should be getting down there. Remember, that's a straight connection, except it goes through a capacitor. My triangle wave is coming out of pin 12 on the 4053. So here's the 4053, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I think this is it. Maybe this one's it. There it is. So I've got my triangle wave, and my sawtooth is coming out of pin 9 on the 4016. There's my sawtooth. Okay, so my signal outs are good. The only thing between the signals out and the signal in is this capacitor and a resistor. If I look at the resistor, it's right here. Oh, using the wrong one. If I look at the resistor, the signal's bad. It's basically the same bad signal I'm getting here. So what that tells me is this capacitor is most likely bad. And in fact, if I put the probe on the cap itself, I can see my wave. So it's not making its way out. So there's another handy trick you can do. You can put the probe on a cap, and that will help you find your signal on these electrolytics. So, handy trick. Okay, so that cap is bad, and now I can keep moving on. Let's go over to voice 4. That's the one that really had problems. So let's see if I've got a signal there. All right, that's oscillator A, looking good. And oscillator B, also looking good. Cool. So the signal is getting here through these capacitors. They're looking good. That means that whatever's going on has something to do with either the IC itself or one of these signals that are coming out. So now's a good time for us to go back to the 3372 schematic itself. Let's see what's happening on the other side of the chip. So pin 18, we've got an 18 volt, this is where we get 18 volts, where we get 15 volts from the power supply. But pin 17, that's pretty interesting, VCF out. And then it goes through a capacitor and comes back in on pin 12. And it also comes in with the resonance on pin 11. We also have some controls happening on pin 13. Now that, and I can't really easily show that to you because I've got my keys locked. And I'm going to get into more detail on that VCF out thing. But pin 13 is our VCA. So I will move this out of the way. 10, 11, 12, 13. There we go. So I've got sustain set up all the way. You can see the thing there. Let me just, I want to turn the sustain down. And you can see that as I turn the sustain down, you can see my sleeve. I may have changed shirts. As I bring this sustain down, then the volume is also going, the voltage is also going down. So your VCA is controlled by the 3372. Your envelopes are controlled by the 3372 on pin 13. Okay? And that's for both of the for both oscillator A and oscillator B. There's a single volume VCA, and that's on pin 13. The other one that's notable is the control voltage for the filter, for the filter frequency. And that's on pin 15. So we'll go here. Now this one's a little bit harder to show because of the way that it's set up. I don't know if we're going to get much out of this, but I'll try turning the filter down, and I don't think you're going to see anything really happening. But if I turn the filter frequency all the way down, then here, I'm turning the filter all the way back up. Now we're back to 220 volts, or 220 millivolts. The envelope is also controlled on pin 15. Okay, so we've got our controls on pin, I already forgot, pin 13 and pin 15. So now, what about these signals? Well, the signal that's going out of the filter, combined filter and VCA, is on pin, I've got to look at it, pin 14. So 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. We'll bring it up on our scope here. There's not much to see. Doesn't really show up as much when you look at it. So, but that is the output. It's going over to an op amp, and it's actually coming over here onto, I don't know if that's visible in the camera, but way up here is another 3360, and that's where the output is actually going over to the output jack. All right, so we can't see much, but what we can see is this pin 17 business, where the output of the filter is coming out. So I'm going to look at this on voice 2. That's pretty high. Let me try turning the gain down on this and see if it makes a difference. I'm going to switch this to AC. I'll make it, heck with it. I'm just going to use the other probe. So many wires. There we go. So there's my wave coming out of pin 17 on voice 2. Should see the same thing just about on voice 3, except it's a little bit weaker because it's not getting oscillator B. Now let's look at voice 4. It's there. So I've got a signal coming out on that filter. So this is where the filter is getting effectively mixed back in to the instrument. It's going through the VCA controls and then going out on pin 14. And it also goes through a capacitor. So this is where some filtering is happening. And I believe it's high. I'm not sure exactly why that filter is there, the 2.2 microfarad and 4.7 microfarad. Maybe it's a high frequency filter. Yeah, I honestly don't remember. But it doesn't matter. Either way, we got signals coming out, but then they come back in on pin 12. So let's look at pin 12. Got nothing there. How about on oscillator 3? There's a signal. And oscillator 2, there's a signal. Let's go check it. Let's bring this back up to 1 times, or turn it off of 10 times. Let's do it with this one. Bring it back down. Oh, that's a huge wave. So look at that. That's my wave coming back in. Wave coming back in, and here's the dead voice. Nada. That's the clue. That's the solution. So the signal isn't making its way back into the 3372 where it can be controlled by the VCA. And the reason for that is somewhere on my desk. It's this. Oh, I know, I get it. It's this capacitor. This multimeter just will not shut up. The capacitor was supposed to be here. In fact, you can see there are two caps here, two caps here, two caps here. This cap had leaked. And it's the same thing, most likely, that happened with this cap here. So that's all there is to it. I just have to replace this electrolytic capacitor and my voice will work again. Same thing here. Replace this electrolytic cap and oscillator B on voice 3 will work again. My signals are going out. So there you go. There's the Prophet-600, a general walkthrough of the different oscillators and switches and filters that you're going to run into in your control voltages, and how to diagnose most of these components. Because the vast majority of problems that you're going to have are in these components here with hand gestures. All right, well, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this, or if you didn't, I don't mind, I guess. Bye.